Welcome to the Hudson Institute. I'm Bryan Clark, a senior fellow at the Institute and director of Hudson Center for Defense Concepts and Technology. And today we are really honored to have a great set of guests to talk about the Navy and its learning processes in connection with a report we recently released at Hudson called Learning to Win. Our panelists today are both authors on the report, as well as experts in Navy and Marine Corps training and learning processes. And I want to introduce them right now before we get started. So first of all, Trent Hone is with us. Trent is Vice President of ICF. He's an authority on early 20th century Navy and a leader in applying complexity science to organizational design. He's a recipient of the U.S. Naval War College's Edward Miller Prize and the Naval History and Heritage Command's Ernest Eller Prize. He's co-author of Battle Line, the United States Navy 1919 to 1939, and is the author of Learning War, the Evolution of the Fighting Doctrine of the U.S. Navy, 1898 to 1945. He's also author of Master of the Art of Command, Admiral Chester Nimitz, and Victory in the Pacific. So we're really honored to have Trent with us today. Thank you, Trent. Also with us is Dmitry Filipoff, who's the online director for the Center for International Maritime Security. Dmitry has been there for several years. He's also the community manager of its Naval Professional Society, the Flotilla. He was on the editorial staff of the Foreign Service Journal from 2015 to 2021, and he's currently a Master of Arts student at Georgetown University's Strategic Studies program. So thank you, Dmitry, for being here. And last with us is Michael Hunzeker. He's an associate professor at George Mason's Schar School of Policy and Government and the associate director of Schar School Center for Strategic or Security Policy Studies, and a senior non-resident fellow at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. He's done a lot of work on deterrence, military adaptation, and war termination, appeared in numerous journals. He also recently published a book on wartime learning, Dying to Learn, Wartime Lessons from the Western Front, which was published by Cornell University Press. He's authored multiple monographs on deterrence in both Europe and the Taiwan Strait. And most important to this discussion, he's a former Marine, having served from 2000 to 2006. And he's also got degrees from Berkeley as well as Princeton University. So thank you very much, Mike, for being here today. To get started, the reason we pursued this report, Learning to Win, using operational innovation to regain the advantage at sea against China, was the frustration that had been experienced by, I think, many people in the Navy, as well as folks that are navalists outside the Navy, with the ability of the Navy to adapt and incorporate new operational concepts and innovations within the service and promulgate those out to the fleet. That is a process that has to be built and mechanized and regimentized and managed over time. It's not something you can pick up at the last minute when you need to suddenly innovate in the face of a determined enemy. You have to have a learning process that's established and in operation before you get to the point of conflict. The U.S. experienced that during the interwar period between World War I and World War II, and used it to great effect to achieve victory in the Pacific in particular. Today, we're facing a peer competitor in China that has the technological and economic power to be able to stay with us in terms of both the size and the capability of their force, which means we are going to be left in our U.S. Navy with the need to operationally innovate to be able to get an edge, as opposed to simply building or advancing our way to a more capable force. So getting that advantage is going to rely on us being able to develop new operational concepts and put those into practice through our learning and evolving training and concept development process. So that's what the focus of the paper is to talk about both the need for that learning process to be implemented and also the way in which you might actually put it into practice in today's Navy. And so to get to the discussion that surrounds both the paper and its implications for the Navy, I want to turn to our guests and get their read on how we are doing as a service in terms of implementing a learning regimen. So, creativity and improvisation are going to be key contributors to U.S. success in future conflicts. We're not going to be able to build our way out of the challenges that we face today. So, how well prepared is today's military and today's Navy to be able to learn to win? And I'll start with you, Trent.
Well, first, let me say, Bryan, thank you for inviting me to participate. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to work on the report. And I also want to extend my gratitude to Dmitry and the other co-authors because I felt like it was a very collaborative approach that we took, and I'm proud of the product that we produced. I'm really glad you asked about creativity and improvisation, because I think those are really crucial. You mentioned the interwar period, and that is a period that I've spent a good deal of time studying. So I come at this from a historical perspective. And Learning War, my book describes how the Navy developed a learning system before World War II that was instrumental to success in that conflict. And I think the Navy needs to invest more in creating something similar today so that it can become a more effective learning organization. One of the things that Mike and I share in terms of our research and study is we emphasize the importance of organizational structure, right? It's not just, it's not just passionate leaders who are going to drive this forward. We have to have patterns within the organization that reinforce it and ensure that the institution can continue to learn effectively as officers come into the service and rotate out. And so key pieces to that are an ability to explore new operational concepts, new tactics, and new techniques, assess those approaches. So the exploration happens. Some of those aren't going to work out. We have to be able to assess which of those things that were explored are effective, so that then we can exploit those, build upon them, and create new concepts based on them, so that we have effective patterns, effective operational constructs for future use. The balance of exploration and exploitation is key to an effective learning organization. And I think in today's Navy, that's going to require a few things. It's going to require what I call a balanced approach to exercises. They need to be relatively loose so that there is plenty of room for creativity and improvisation, the two things that you mentioned. Training needs to take care of standardized procedures so that there is a baseline of competence that can then become the springboard for effective and creative problem solving. Now, at the same time, exercises need to be focused. They need to be constrained. What is the problem that the officers and sailors involved are trying to work toward? So that's going to be to channel creative energy and also give the Navy some feedback. Were we able to achieve this operation, this concept, this approach that we set out to work on? So exercises need some boundary conditions, that focused objective. They need to be scoped in terms of time and duration, geographic area, and also forces available. One of the things that was quite useful as a forcing function in the 20s and 30s is there are only so many ships. They did use constructive ones when they had to, constructive being, fake ones that didn't actually exist. But we will only have so many ships. And so there's got to be work to sort out how do we use that most effectively? And then how do we integrate unmanned systems into the current force? That needs to be studied more effectively. Now, in the 20s and 30s, this was quite effective, and as we all know, led to a number of innovative approaches, like how best to integrate carrier air power with the fleet, improved tactics and techniques for surface combat, and an understanding of the limitations of submarines and their ability to work with a mid-20th century fleet, much less capable than the boats that we have today. Now, that's all useful, but I think what was really crucial, and this is a point that I've tried to make time and again, is that it's the system that was built up around that was so valuable, because in World War II, the Navy could exploit it. It could build on that. Now, today, those large exercises of the 20s and 30s, the fleet problems, the Navy's not going to be in a position to recreate them directly, and I think trying to do that would be a fool's errand. But there are techniques from them that proved effective, like the open-ended nature to encourage creativity and problem solving. One thing that I think it always becomes a topic of discussion when I share this with today's naval officers is they had large debriefs from those exercises and brought lots of commanding officers together so they could develop a shared perspective of what happened, who made what decision and when and why, what information did they have available, and if it wasn't the right decision, how could we make sure that they had more information so that they could make a better decision? That collective analysis and problem solving, I think, was really important. Similar things today, I think, would be quite valuable. And then at the same time, something that Mike has written more about, there needs to be an assessment mechanism, right? It can't just be we do the exercise and everybody walks out with their own sense of how to improve. There needs to be some centralized assessment of, okay, which of these techniques we experimented with, which ones worked, which ones didn't work quite so well, and where is there opportunity for future exploitation? What should get folded into today's concepts and today's tactics and doctrine to make us better in the future? And what should we consider a dead end, something that didn't work quite so well? There's a number of points that I'd also like to make, but I want to give the other panelists an opportunity to chime in with their thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Trent. Those are terrific points. That's a great overview of sort of where we need to go in terms of becoming a learning Navy. So to go to Dmitry, you follow the Navy pretty closely as the online editor for CIMSEC, the Center for International Maritime Security, and so you've been sort of had a front seat to a lot of this discussion inside the fleet and with your with the flotilla. What's being discussed among young officers today. So how well are we doing at implementing some of the ideas that Trent's talking about here in terms of enabling creativity to be exploited, by the naval service?
Yeah, no, it's an important question to ask. And the sense that I get from folks on deck plate and having read and researched and read about this stuff for a while is that the Navy's in a pretty challenged position to make this stuff happen. And there's two main things that are kind of driving the challenge and constricting the space for this. One is the requirement system, and the other is operational demand. And both those things are coming together to restrict the amount of time that people have available to focus on learning. So, with requirements, these communities have all sorts of requirements being pushed down on them, by higher ups and, whatever demands are coming their way. But it's not the most, it's not always the most thoughtful process. There's not careful trade-offs being made. It's not the most disciplined exchange of, we're going to emphasize one thing over another. It's typically a lot of requirements are being pushed down on the sailors, and they have to kind of sort it out themselves in a way. And so that's really that's a major challenge, especially when it comes to like the workup cycle and the force development side of it. When you look at the force employment side of it, the demand signals and the demand for foreign presence is really constricting a lot of availability of operating forces to engage in operational learning. And it's there's beliefs out there about forward presence, that forward presence can be both force employment and force development at the same time. And I'm not too sure about that philosophy, mainly because the Navy has concerns, valid concerns about being surveilled in forward areas, and so it's not going to practice certain TTPs in forward areas. There's going to be concerns over classification when it comes to sharing things with allies and partners. And so there is a distinct difference between doing force development exercises at home versus doing things abroad. And that's something that needs to be factored in here. And so, when it comes between the requirements and the demand for forward presence, these two things are really constricting the time available to the Navy. And difficult trade-offs are going to have to be made in those areas if you really want to increase the amount of time, forces, and money for better operational learning. And Bryan, it was good that you mentioned the disconnect in the beginning, because we do see these kind of warfighting concepts come out, a lot of net-centric warfighting concepts in the past 20, 30 years. But is that actually making it to the deck plate? Is it actually, is there people out there who are taking something like an air-sea battle concept and turning it into new tactical development agendas, new exercises, new training? And it seems like not as well as you would want them to. And so it's it's one thing to have this force, this warfighting concept development process, but if you don't have a force development process to actually make it into something real, then there can be a disconnect between the things that happen in places like these centers of excellence versus the actual lived experience of the sailors who will be the ones asked to execute these warfighting concepts. And so we need to be very conscious of that disconnect. And a major point is that these things are going to take a lot of time. A warfighting concept can probably take on the order of 5, 10, 15 years to probably really flesh out, to really have enough trial and error that you have something that is viable and that's something that can stand the rigors of war. And so you have to really go the distance with it. It is a major undertaking. It's of course, it's always better to do this thing in peacetime and in wartime. And this is a really critical point, because sometimes, you get this feedback or this impression that, maybe these efforts are not so important, that, we've got forward operations to do, we have presence to do. But the fact is that if you're in a war and your capabilities and your tactics are breaking down, it's going to go to the top of the list of your priorities. And so it's something that, I know the other authors here and contributors have seen in their work, where, they have seen how pre-war concepts hold up in a wartime environment, and those militaries literally don't have a choice but to make a major effort to figure out how to innovate in the middle of a war. And that can be a very uncomfortable process. And so obviously you want to get this right in peacetime, because wartime is just about the worst time to be figuring these things out. And the better you do in peacetime, the better you can focus yourself on wartime proactive evolution instead of retroactive corrective action. And so basically, for a naval history example, you would rather be taking those hard-earned combat lessons to figure out how to make the next best torpedo, rather than figuring out what's going wrong with the ones you already have. And so, and just to kind of take a bigger picture look at it, I think it's really important to ask this question. How good are the militaries at learning? Because sometimes there can be an assumption that they're always great at learning, they're always evolving, but we can't confuse activity with progress when it comes to a lot of these things. And we can't mistake capability introduction for force development progress, because every time a new capability or a new technology is introduced, there are downstream requirements for training, for tactical development, and it's not always clear how well the system is going to be able to absorb that and turn it into something that actually creates warfighting advantage. And so this whole thing about how well are we good at learning about warfighting, it's a very important exercise in force development and self-awareness as well.
Yeah, Dmitry, I think you bring up some great points there about the need to dedicate forces and time to this effort, and then also to remedy this disconnect between concept development and force development or implementation. And then all those just the challenges being placed on naval officers and enlisted people as they try to innovate while simultaneously doing their day jobs. And so Mike, turning to you, as a former Marine, obviously improvisation and innovation is something that's built into the Marine ethos. And the Marines of today have, there's a lot of concept development, a lot of energy going into developing new ways to operate in contested environments like the Western Pacific. But to step back broadly to the naval service and think about how militaries learn, how well are we doing at being able to address some of the challenges that Dmitry lays out to try to create a learning system in today's U.S. military, and in particular in the naval service?
So it's a great question. I've got some thoughts on it. Before I get to those thoughts, though, I think a couple of quick thanks are in order. First, obviously, thank you for inviting me to participate on this panel and be a part of this conversation. But I also want to thank the authors of this report. I think it's a really fabulous report. And I say this as somebody who's kind of waited around in these types of issues for some number of years. And you can also take this as honestly, because I wasn't a part of the report. I didn't contribute to it. I'm not an author, and we're on Zoom, so I can tell and everyone else can tell. Nobody slipped me a $20 bill to say it. But the fact is, more accurately, at least my view is, I really do hope that learning to win makes waves among senior officers and officials, because it does bring to the foreground a critical source of competitive advantage for all of our talk about competition with China that just all too often lingers in the background. And I think this report does an important job of not just reminding us that if we want to regain the competitive advantage over China, that if we're really actually serious about deterring Chinese aggression by convincing Beijing that we are ready and we are able to sustain an away game 7,000 miles away from our shore, we're not going to do it with just drones and robots and electromagnetic pulses alone. Ideas matter, learning matters. And I also love that the report, it doesn't, and I say this again as an academic, so I'm kind of casting aspersions on myself here, but it doesn't muck around in the black hole of academic literature on organizational change, which is just massive and one can get lost quickly. Instead, each of the chapters, they have a laser sharp focus on identifying practical and doable recommendations to help the Navy and Marine Corps team optimize their capacity for learning, like realistic options that still allow the Navy and Marine Corps to necessarily deal with the persistent demands that today's sailors and Marines just can't ignore. So again, kudos to the authors, although I got to warn everybody that my praise plus $3.50 with inflation will buy you a cup of coffee, but it is what it is. It's a terrific report. And I truly, and this is rare for me as an academic, I don't have anything to critique or nitpick. So I'm going to try to use what little time I do have to instead just offer 3 ways that I hope those who read this report, especially in the strategic and policymaking community, try to build on your important findings. First, and here I'm really building on things that both Trent and Dmitry pointed out, but I'll be even more explicit. Although this report necessarily, correctly, appropriately focuses on the peacetime learning challenge, as it should, I hope that civilian officials and senior officers do not overlook the equally important, yet I think conceptually distinct challenge of wartime learning. The Navy and the Marine Corps, they should continue to do everything they can to develop, refine, disseminate the right tactics, techniques, procedures, operational concepts, and doctrines that they can. But I think history tells us no matter how hard we try, and we should try, we're still going to get it wrong, or at least we're not going to get it quite right. And I do take Dmitry's point, better to optimize a torpedo than to have one that just doesn't work. But whether we're off by a little bit or a lot, the fact is our sailors and Marines are going to find themselves in a position, if war does break out, that we're going to have to close that gap under fire. Which means I really hope the Pentagon spends at least as much time making sure our fighting forces are ready to learn once the bullets and the drones start flying as they are, and figuring out how many bullets and how many drones we need to buy. Now, I should say, for those who have had the chance to read Trent's excellent chapter, I completely agree with the point that organizations that manage to become learning organizations in peacetime are in a much better position to learn once the shooting starts. But I still worry that it's not quite enough, because the exigencies of wartime mobilization tend to just suck all the oxygen out of the room, and they overwhelm peacetime learning processes, and they divert critical resources and, crucially important, critical personnel who had been engaged in the learning process in peacetime, so that they can fill gaps and holes that are of wartime necessity. So in my mind, without deliberate planning and preparation to think about how we transfer peacetime learning into wartime learning, to codify learning practices, to stress test them to the greatest degree possible, and to ensure that the personnel responsible for peacetime learning aren't immediately yanked from their jobs when the shooting starts to go fill some other role, and or even worse yet, relegated to the sidelines. It's not to say we won't have time, I think, to recover from our inevitable mistakes, or that the other side's not going to make the same mistakes or worse. I have zero doubt, unfortunately, in my research, that the conflict between China and the United States could very well develop into a hurting stalemate that gives both sides plenty of time to adjust. Nor do I think that a political military like the PLA is necessarily going to be better than us at these challenges. But again, I would prefer that we do everything in our power to learn in peacetime and to prepare to learn in wartime, since the price for failing to do so is measured in blood and treasure. Second, I very much hope that policymakers and officials who read this report will read it with an eye, and Dmitry mentioned this briefly, but an eye toward learning among allies. Obviously, the United States has no intention of trying to go it alone, nor should we, in a great power conflict thousands of miles from our shore. And the Navy and Marine Corps are clearly wrestling with a range of daunting gaps and challenges as they contemplate how to fight in the Pacific. But while allied learning may not be among the most urgent of priorities right now compared to everything else, it also isn't something I think we should ignore or take for granted. History suggests that happens all the time. In peacetime in particular here, I think finding ways to deliberately integrate our allies and partners into a shared learning process could, well, both tap into new sources of creativity. Of course, there are challenges with operational security we have to be sensitive to, but also help us guard against our own tendencies and biases in thinking about these problems. And in wartime, to the degree we can build these processes now, the more effective our combined learning processes are, the more likely we're going to be able to fight as a true integrated coalition, and one that can learn at that. Third and finally, and then I'll shut up, I hope this report nudges civilian and uniformed officers and officials to take a good, hard look at existing practices. And I would agree. I think we tend to pat ourselves on the back a little too much for being a learning organization, when in reality, we just learn better than the next side, at least for now. And because, if I'm being honest, and I can be honest because I'm an academic and no one listens to me anyway, I do think we tend to overestimate how well we learn, and that we tend to put the emphasis on the wrong syllable when it comes to thinking about change. In particular here, Trent's point about overemphasizing leaders and underemphasizing structures, I would just double down on. The thing is, when it comes to learning, the devil really is in the detail. And as I've said, that's one of the great things about this report. It offers concrete, granular recommendations, like specific exercises like SWAT and practices like TOL worth emulating and building upon. As a former Marine, I would be remiss if I didn't at least toss in some of the Marine Corps' ongoing activities with Talent Management 2030 and its campaign of learning last year as things to think about and emulate as well. But still, I think the services writ large have a ways to go if the goal is to become a true learning organization. So let me just wrap up by offering at least two areas I think bear future criticism and rigorous assessment. The first has to do with something we've already talked about, which is our system for capturing lessons learned. As a much smarter person than me put it to me once, I don't think the services do lessons learned so much as they do lessons collected and disseminated. And I would agree that although all of the services have done a great job of capturing frontline experiences and ideas, we all still have a ways to go when it comes to thinking about how to better process, analyze, and filter them so they are of maximum value to warfighters and leaders, and so they aren't buried under this trove of incoming data when the fighting starts. The second, and this is really niche, but I think super important, and it will be much more important than we realize right now, is military medicine. Although the report necessarily, appropriately, properly prioritizes learning among frontline combat forces, I worry that learning among critical enablers isn't getting enough attention right now. In particular, especially with some of the things the Marine Corps is thinking about stand-in forces and littoral regiments, it would be useful to think hard about how the military medical community is learning, what they're learning, and the degree to which this learning is integrated into our broader operational concept development. Because I do worry, and I say this as the spouse of a military officer who's in medicine and a brother of another military doctor, I sense a growing disconnect between what we know great power war looks like, how we think we're going to fight that great power war, what military medicine is actually preparing to handle, and what the American people have come to expect in terms of casualty care. So with that, I'll stop. Again, it's a terrific report. It deserves to make a splash. And thanks for inviting me to join in on the conversation.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for the praise. Thank you for reading the report and for those excellent comments. I think you bring up three really good points that we should be addressing during the rest of our conversation here today. And so I think to kind of step back and bring up a couple of issues that you guys have raised in the course of the panel. Trent, one thing you brought up was the need for assessment and the fact that you've got, and then also Dmitry and Mike have brought up as well, the need to basically close the loop for being able to take insights from experimentation and from concept development and turn those into something that's actually returned to the concept development process and into the training process. Are we doing that today in today's Navy? And to be able to close that loop, what's going to be necessary in terms of either the organizational structure or the resource allocation? Because it seems like that's kind of a fundamental problem that is holding up the ability of the Navy to innovate operationally, is this closing the loop piece of it.
Well, I can start. It gets back to what Mike was talking about with lessons learned. Part of this is lessons learned, and part of it is also assessments of operational effectiveness. To extend the torpedo analogy, right? This is an area that I think about a good bit because it comes down to feedback. The Navy's Bureau of Ordnance before World War II did not get sufficient feedback about the actual performance of its torpedoes. And so they performed very poorly when exposed to actual, the actual operating environment. And I think the Navy is more aware today of the importance of that kind of operations and testing. So there is an effort to put that forward and to get the kind of feedback that is necessary. My concern is the speed of the loop. The feedback loop needs to be relatively rapid, and it also needs to, I think, invest more in the points where put more emphasis on where that learning is going to be fastest, and that learning is going to be fastest in the field. That learning is going to be fastest, among the deck plate. And I worry that now we have a procurement system, for example, that is very good at formulating requirements and procuring large platforms that take years to put into place. And it's very efficient at that. It's organized for that. It's built around that. But as we can see now with the proliferation of modern technologies and their use, primarily here I'm thinking about software, but I'm sure people's minds will go to the quadcopters that are being used in Ukraine for all manner of things. Logistic support and even strike. That is happening very, very rapidly. And so how can the Navy and the Marine Corps and the other services begin to introduce patterns that allow us to not only explore these new technologies, but more rapidly create something, get feedback on it, and determine what is going to be useful, and then how to tailor that into something that is going to be effective, operationally or in the different critical enablers like military medicine that Mike mentioned, because we shouldn't restrict this just to such a narrow scope. So to me, it's how does the feedback loop around gathering equipment, procuring it, developing, what does it have to do, and then actually getting into the hands of someone where it can be effective. That is something that needs to accelerate. And I think a lot of thought needs to be put into that. We need new channels for how to procure these smaller, more disposable things, and especially software enabled functions that allow us to do that faster, to keep up with the pace of potential opponents and also what's going on in industry.
Yeah, and that sort of recalls a DevOps approach or development operations approach, like you might use in software development. The insights or the feedback from the user, and then be able to plow that back into the next iteration of the software. And so Dmitry, the Navy does a lot of experimentation and exercises already. We just completed RIMPAC. We just did Pitch Black, no, but we just completed another set of exercises in Australia. So we're doing exercises all the time and experimentation pretty frequently. We have a task force in the Middle East now doing experimentation on unmanned systems. Does it appear that the results of these exercises are actually driving change, or does it seem like these exercises and experiments largely are designed to help foster goodwill between allies, or to demonstrate certain capabilities that we want to show a potential adversary? I don't get the impression, looking at these exercises and experiments, that those results are getting plowed into force design and then that shows up in a future iteration of the fleet. What do you see it as?
Yeah, it's hard to know the exact relationships and feedback mechanisms that are happening. But going back to the comment that we can't confuse a lot of activity with a lot of learning, because and the main difference is it has to do with design and the quality of the design of the exercises and the quality of the learning architecture around the exercises. And my section of the report focused mainly on combat exercises, and everyone in the report, I think, focused a lot on combat exercises. And I think one reason that we focused on that specific venue as a central area of learning is that there's certain really important principles of learning that come into play with combat exercises, specifically things like learning by doing, trying things out in the real world, and involving the deck plate warfighters. Those are all really important principles, and not everything that happens in force development can cover those same bases. Like wargaming is great and does a lot of things that you can't do in the real world, but it doesn't cover those exact same bases as well as real world exercises can. And so in terms of like the design of the exercises, some of the other folks have spoken to this, but these things tend to be heavily scripted in the sense that, often warfighters go into it knowing what's going to happen. They know what the outcome is going to be, and sometimes things are scripted in such a way that the preferred outcome is what happens. And so there's not that much free play. There's not that much element of surprise. And so there's, the ability to learn from things is closely tied to how much you can tolerate a free play sort of environment. If you go into an exercise knowing exactly what's going to happen and you get the result that you want, can you really say with confidence that you've learned something when it comes to something as chaotic and complicated as warfighting? And so it's important to make sure that we have more free play. And also there needs to be a connection between the exercise design and other parts of force development. For example, just based off of open source, material, we know that in high level DoD war games that the Navy does take heavy losses in certain China scenarios. And apparently that is also reflected, we can ascertain that is reflected in the O plans, the war plans. But those kinds of hard fought heavy losses, that kind of combat doesn't exactly happen in a lot of these exercises because of how scripted things are. And so there's a disconnect there. And so we need to make sure that there's alignment between the realism of the war games, the war plans, and the exercises, because ultimately that could mean that you are basically sending people to execute war plans that they haven't really been trained to do, and that's a major area of risk. And in terms of design, it's important to organize these things as series. That you need to build in from the beginning that you're going to be doing trial and error, rinse and repeat. You can't figure anything out really on the first try, but this kind of comes back to the pressures faced from demands of resources and requirements, where it's extremely hard to organize a series of exercises in a big way, and that creates pressure to script things. So if you only have enough forces on hand, you may script things in such a way as that you only really have one exercise to get it right, so to speak. And then a lot of other institutions will look at a big exercise and see it as an opportunity to sort of inject their agenda into it. And then you have all sorts of other stakeholders kind of putting their experimentation agendas and their projects into a big exercise. And it really complicates the ability to organize feedback and have an iterative process. You need to be able to concentrate, and you need to be able to go the distance in a series. And I like what happens in Red Flag with what the Air Force does is their premier kind of force-on-force exercise, where Based off of research from the combat losses of Vietnam, they found that if you survive your first 10 combat missions, your chances of success in surviving go way up. And so Red Flag organizes those first 10 combat missions for pilots. But where else in the Navy do we see that kind of principle being put into practice? And also one big thing in terms of the structure and design of exercises is that I think the Navy has conflated training with certification or experimentation with certification. The certification environment or mindset, a sort of pass-fail type of mindset, is not conducive to learning. And this is something that, was directly referenced in my report. And I quoted some Navy captains who went through a new SWAT exercise that is apparently one of the Surface Navy's best exercises, where they outright say that this does not have a certification element, and this is critical to making this a learning environment. So we've heard from people in the deck plate that we need to take out certification type of systems to maximize learning. But if most of the Navy's training system is by default a certification system, then you're not getting as much learning as you really want. And so one thing that we advocate, or I advocate in the report, is that, maybe you want to expand that sort of design construct to other parts and not have everything be a certification event. And I'll stop there.
Yeah. So a great point, Dmitry, because that raises, the fundamental issue is there's processes that the Navy needs to have to be able to certify that troops and forces are safe to operate and are proficient enough to conduct the operations that a commander might task them with. And then you've got a whole separate line of effort that has to surround experimentation and learning. And I think, as you said, we tend to conflate these two things. And I think there's been a lot of frustration when you look at the senior DoD levels and also over in Congress, that there's been very little innovation coming out of the U.S. military operationally. And in part, that's because we tend to conflate this idea of certification with innovation, because we're using the same events to try to accomplish both tasks. So Mike, turning to you, how do you, how should we be thinking about trying to get the military, the Navy in particular, to start, separating out the certification process that has to be done to ensure safe and effective, or at least reliable operations from the whole line of effort that has to be done in order to operationally innovate and start to exploit the creativity of our forces? It seems like that's really, if we can't differentiate those two things, we're going to continue to have the problem Dmitry's describing.
Yeah, it's a terrific question. And I guess the best answer I can offer right now is to bring in an element that, really hasn't come into the conversation and not to the report. And I get that the report, again, it's focused very, very specifically on the Navy and Marine Corps team. And one of the things, despite the fact that we tend to critique the services endlessly, the services are very good, I think, at criticizing themselves. And I think many of the issues that have been raised, if you talk to sailors and Marines over the years, these are complaints and concerns that they've had. Again, this idea about lessons collected and disseminated versus lessons learned, that came from the service and its own self-reflection on its own practices. And yet, of course, we find ourselves in this Groundhog Day kind of endless wheel where for decades people have been saying the same thing, and yet we can't seem to break free of it. And so I guess I would suggest that part of this really comes down to politics. And I'm not talking intra-service politics or politics over the budget chair, but literally political leadership. And the fact of the matter is, we live in a country where appropriately the military falls in on political guidance and direction. And much, I think, of the risk aversion that comes, this insistence that we have to certify. And of course, the irony is certification assumes you know what the right answer looks like, which is we start to get to this level of what is war with China? I don't know how we certify somebody to say we're ready to do that. But at the end of the day, we have a lot of competing political interests and incentives that are being, I should say the right to be wrong, that are rightfully in the right to be wrong sense of the term, being imposed by Congress and the executive branch. And I would also, though, argue that very few people at the political level of leadership have thought about these challenges to the degree that the services and our conversations here we're having. And so a big piece of this, I think, comes down to political leadership doing what political leadership needs to do, which is to explain to the American people what great power conflict is going to look like. And that if we really want to reduce the cost of waging that war, to wage it as efficiently, effectively as possible, there are risks we are going to have to take. And you can see, I think, the services having to spend a fair amount of bandwidth fighting against this challenge. In particular here, I point to some of the efforts with Force Design 2030 and the fact that the Commandant is constantly having to fight off flanking attacks, not just from former graybeards, or graybeards, I guess they're not former, but also from Congress and vested interests who realize, well, we won't be buying many more high-end platforms that cost lots of money and therefore cost my congressional district lots of money. And I think it's really interesting. I don't think it's by accident that some of the innovation that's occurring with Force Design 2030 was actually occurring in Europe with Task Force, what is it, 61 TAC 2, which I think is a deliberate attempt to say, listen, we are not developing a concept which is only narrowly tailored to the problem we face in the Indo-Pacific, but look, we can use these same concepts in Norway too. And although that's an applaudable goal to seek, I think in some ways that's wasting resources, wasting time, and wasting energy to find a way so that the Marine Corps can do what it knows it needs to do, but at the same time satiate critics that say, well, you need to be a global force in readiness.
Yeah, good point, Mike. And the need to battle the institutional antibodies when it comes to making changes like this it does create a demand signal that's going to take time away that leaders would otherwise apply to learning. So Trent, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, because Mike mentioned something that is a bit of a hot button topic for me, something I think a lot about and really think that is going to be crucial here. Because Bryan, you asked, how can the Navy or the nation's other services deal with this challenge of making sure that there's a certain level of competency, but at the same time explore and attempt to innovate. And I think risk aversion, that's what Mike mentioned, is a really crucial part of this. The attitude toward risk, to my mind, has to shift. This is one of the fundamental differences that I try to highlight between the interwar period and today. Today, there's a tacit assumption in the Navy that we can identify risks ahead of time and manage them out. If we design the exercise right, if we frame the orders right, if we craft the operation right, there won't be risk, or we will reduce it to a sufficient level that we'll be fine. And prior to World War II, the attitude was different. Risk is seen as sort of the flip side of opportunity. You can't design it out. This is going to happen. Conflict and even an exercise, they are two different things, as Mike pointed out. But emergence will happen over the course of that. There will be events that we haven't anticipated. Some of those are going to be risks. Some of those are going to be opportunities, and we have to prepare officers and sailors to seize on the opportunities. Either address the risk as it's emerging. Use your individual initiative, take action, deal with it, or if it's an opportunity, seize it. Grab the moment, depart from standard procedure, and do the thing that is right to secure a more favorable position for your ship or for your force. And so when I discuss this with today's naval officers or review how things are being done in parts of the Navy with them, I am struck by how this influence of we've got to deal with the risks ahead of time. This assumption that we can know them. We can confidently identify them and then sort of work them out. I think it's debilitating, because at an intuitive level, some of the officers recognize this. Like, that's impossible. That's not how life is, right? If you're trying to plan a family event, even something as simple as that will lead you to unanticipated circumstances. Someone will run out of gas, some child won't get ready on time, et cetera, et cetera. These things just happen in life, but the influence of them the magnitude is so much greater when we're talking about human conflict. And so the Navy needs to start thinking about risk as something that it can exploit. It's going to be there. It's going to be a factor. How do we prepare officers and sailors to deal with it so that we can capitalize on it when it occurs in our favor? I think that's going to be crucial. And for me, that's one of the ways in which the transition that Mike was talking about, because wartime learning is different than peacetime learning. We've got to prepare for this transition. I think inculcating that kind of mindset into the officer community and the sailors is going to be key to making that transition as smooth or smoother than it would otherwise be.
Yeah, Trent, great point, because like you guys have said, this is a process that you have to develop in peacetime and then expect to have to continue into war, where I think in previous generations, or even our current force, the expectation is well, once the fighting starts, our risk tolerance will go down or go up rather. We'll be able to accept more risk. We'll do more experimentation. We'll learn more effectively once we get into a confrontation, which seems like, that's not going to set, if you don't have a process in place to exploit that, then you're also having to create the organizational structure that does that as well as actually undertake the experimentation. So do we need to start thinking, and so Dmitry, this is something that I think you focused some of your writing on in both in SimSec, but also in the report. Do we need to start thinking about allocating forces specifically to the purpose of experimentation? So when we start when we have our force generation process, we prepare, units to go out under the optimized fleet response plan. They prepare for deployment. There's going to be some after they've reached that level of certification that they can deploy. They should be going off to do experimentation versus ones that might actually go out and do a presence mission or accomplish some task that's being provided by the combatant commander. Do we need to start thinking about creating a demand signal for experimentation and learning that is, just as strong as the one that's provided by the combatant commanders?
I definitely think so, and I think it needs to be instituted, and it needs to be something that is guaranteed and protected. And I think it's important to understand that the Navy operates under a very different system compared to the other services. For the Army, for example, I think sends about a third of their active duty brigades to the National Training Center every year to do large-scale force-on-force exercises. For the Air Force, they send hundreds of planes every year to Red Flag. And so the combatant commander demand signals and global force management has preserved for those services to have enough ready forces to do these exercises frequently every year. The Navy doesn't operate under that kind of model. Basically, as soon as a naval formation or a task force comes through the workup cycle, is certified and maintained and ready for deployment, it's immediately allocated toward combatant commander demand. And so the Navy is essentially the only service that is mostly deprived of having any ready forces of its own for force development exercises. It needs to have those forces to be able to resource its force development agenda, because the combatant commanders just don't have that mandate. They focus on force employment. They don't focus on train, man, equip. The services do need to have their own ready forces to manage these kinds of things. And so, yes, it does need to be something that is deliberately allocated into global force management, and those forces need to be protected. And it's challenging because, as I said at the beginning, there is sort of a mindset that you can do both at the same time through forward presence, and that, you can operationalize forward presence and basically do operational learning while you're in forward areas. But I don't think that's necessarily right. I think that's conflating force employment with force development. And some folks have recently said and published some writings saying that these forward operations are the forge of our combat credibility. They're the forge of our forces. But if you look at these exercises, if you look at these operations, you're looking at things like security cooperation. You're looking at things like maritime security or whatever it is. Pretty scripted exercises with allies and partners. And so if these relatively mild operations are tougher than the Navy's premier combat exercises, that's kind of backwards, to be frank. Ideally, you want anything that you face in the real world, anything you face in the forward operating environment, including actual battles and wars, you want that to be easier than your actual combat exercises. That's the ideal. And so it needs to be resourced. It needs to be managed. The Navy can't think it's doing all these things at the same time through forward presence, and it needs to be able to make that distinction.
That brings up a couple of issues. One is I guess it brings up the point that if the risk tolerance is different for experimentation compared to a certification event and deployment, you're going to want a whole different organizational structure and set of leaders that are thinking about experimentation and force development versus those that are focused on deployment and operations today. I mean, I think it's almost like you need a different set of metrics and a different set of priorities established for the forces that are going to go to a deployment for a combat commander than the ones that are going to take off and go do experimentation with, and to try to do those together in a forward deployed area. There's obviously operational security concerns, but there's also just a set of metrics for risk tolerance and what constitutes effective operations that are going to be different. And you kind of want to make people, when they're deploying into an exercise or an experimentation environment, probably want to be deploying with a different mindset than the ones that are deploying to go do missions that the combat commander has. Mike, you wanted to weigh in?
Yeah, and sorry, Zoom doesn't have a two finger, but a quick two finger as I'm nodding my head in agreement till it falls off with both the premise of the question, Dmitry's excellent answer. Of course, if we red cell it, we know almost immediately the bureaucratic response will be, yeah, of course, that's a great thing, but we can't give out of high here. We only have so many forces available. The opportunity cost is too great. And so just to provide a preemptive talking point here, It is true that the opportunity cost will be severe and it will come to the detriment of presence and all those other things we have to be doing in real time. But that opportunity cost, that demand, that constraint will actually be even greater in wartime than in peacetime. And here I would just point to a really interesting and important example drawn from history. A lot of people may not know it, but one of the most interesting examples of like wartime learning occurred in the German army towards the end of the First World War. And here's this really interesting thing is the German army recognizes it had to find a different way of fighting to break through the deadlock on the Western Front. It optimizes kind of from the bottom up and the top down at the same time, this new approach, but it realizes the biggest impediment to implementing this approach will actually come from the senior officers themselves. They're the ones who, are most likely to resist. And so they realized, well, before we train the troops on the front line, we need to train the generals and we need to let them really exercise, but we can't train them in a war game or simulation. So that German high command actually pulled off an entire division from the Western Front. You have to remember their manpower situation was not wonderful at the time. And it allocated an entire division of troops so that every high-ranking officer could run through this exercise, this program, to practice with these new concepts and to practice it with a full complement of soldiers, with the recognition that if it didn't pay this price, take this risk to pull these troops off the front, it was worth doing so because, number one, the people most responsible for implementing this new idea would have no idea what they were actually doing. And then number two, they would be more likely than not to continue to resist or to foot drag or to slow roll implementation. So it strikes me that given these opportunity costs, how they get more pernicious in wartime scenarios than in peacetime scenarios, that's something just, again, to try to put out there as a talking point, both to political leaders, but to high level officers as well, that this is a price worth paying now because it only goes higher later.
Yeah, great point. And which makes me wonder. And so Trent, you do work in terms of learning, both for, looking at the military context, but you also look at it in the civilian and commercial context as well, and how learning happens in organizations. And I'm wondering, how in general, organizations that make themselves into learning organizations, whether they're military or not, do they have to undertake this effort to essentially establish a vanguard force, a organizational unit that is just doing innovation, operational innovation, or tactical innovation, to free up the brain power and also just establish the different frameworks and metrics that you need to do experimentation? Is this something that's commonly done both in and out of the military?
It is something that is commonly done, especially with organizations that feel like they have to retool or introduce a new way of working. So one of the delicate balancing acts that the organizations who take this approach have to strike is how do you form that group and then protect it sufficiently so that it can continue to do its work, so that it's not, picked apart, with what the kinds of pressure that Dmitry and Mike were talking about, right? How is it preserved? How is it protected? And then how do you, once it has gained some momentum, once it is working, once there are a better sense of the kinds of metrics that can measure this new approach that you would like to undertake, how do you then begin to spread it out? And there's different schools of thought about how to scale that, how to introduce it back into the organization, and how to make that most effective. And sometimes what is going to be most effective, to my mind, is going to depend on the nature of the organization, the kind of change that needs to be undertaken. But I really liked Mike's point about, we probably don't think of division commanders as middle managers, but I mean they have some parallel to middle managers in a modern organization, and there's a lot of literature addressing the fact that oftentimes you'll get a desire for change low in an organization, near where the work is being done, or at the place where the work is being done, and then high in the organization because they can see the challenges that are in the future that need to be addressed. And it's that middle layer that is sometimes most comfortable and most difficult to convince that there is a need for change. And that's where a lot of the focus has to be, is how do you undergo what is called a change management problem with those people? How do you get them to first recognize the need to adjust their behavior? And then second, how do you train them or inculcate within them this new kind of behavior that they need to have in order to make the change sustainable and spread it beyond that initial group? And I think that I appreciate your question, because it feels like in some ways this is where the Navy is today. We've talked about organizational structure, we've talked about the shape of exercises, we've talked about feedback loops, but there's also a cultural element of what kind of behavior should officers be incentivizing and reinforcing. And I think some of what we've touched on suggests a shift there. And it's I don't want to, culture can be so amorphous as to make it very difficult to figure out where to grasp onto it, where to start to change it. And that's why I emphasize organizational structure, feedback loops, things that are much more tangible, because I think if you introduce those in the right way, they'll have a knock-on effect. They'll culture will follow along with the changes in behavior. But I don't think that means that we could ignore the fact that some of what we're talking about is changing cultural attitudes and the behaviors that reinforce them.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the structure, and you're right. I mean, I think the structures drive a lot of that culture. And it's a matter of just slowly, kind of evolving those structures to reflect the need to establish the learning process within the Navy, which might require this sort of bifurcated approach initially to having an innovation arm and a operational arm, if you will. But there's multiple paths to get there. But clearly, the Navy's current approach of trying to do it all together and do it all at the same time with the same forces is probably doesn't seem to be yielding the kind of benefits that the Navy needs in order to be able to operationally innovate. So I think that's a good place to wrap it up. So I wanted to turn to you all and ask for any closing thoughts you have before we close out the conversation. So I'll turn to you, Dmitry, first. Closing thoughts before we wrap up.
Yeah, thank you, Bryan. I think this is an important topic to keep driving on, because if you can focus on force development and have operational learning be an area of competitive advantage, that will serve a military very well in the time of great power competition. And having researched some of the things that the Chinese Navy is doing in these very same aspects, combat exercises, force development, the quality of their opposition forces, they are extremely serious about this. And it is an area where they are trying to find competitive advantage. And so I think it's important to understand that this is a two-sided interactive process, and that we need to be mindful of how well the Navy is learning in order to understand that, how are we going to make our warfighting concepts real, and how are we going to make sure that our deck plate warfighters are benefiting from these warfighting concepts.
Good points. Mike.
So I've built whatever modest academic career I have by basically doing research of reading smarter people and then invoking them. So let me just wrap up by saying and invoking what I found to be a really influential piece that I hope everybody reads as they think about the challenge of gaining a competitive advantage, which is Dr. Tom Ehrhart's piece on treating the pathologies of victory. And I think at the conclusion of that very short, succinct, but important piece, he just makes a point that has stuck with me since I read it and really changed the way I think about this challenge of learning and adapting in war and in peace, which is that the most important thing of all is fear. And if we aren't just utterly terrified of getting it wrong and the consequences of that, if we are really just still basking in the glory of our heydays of the 90s or convincing ourselves that we really did master counterinsurgency, then we are probably not thinking in the right mindset, and we are not inculcating the right kind of culture to really face these challenges head on and to do the necessary things we do, take the necessary painful steps we need to take, accept the risks we have to accept, to improve our odds as we deal with the challenge.
Yeah, great point, because I think we need to have some forcing function that's going to make the Navy create the learning processes, because there's a resource allocation that has to be made to that's going to be painful, and it's going to require some institutional infighting or bureaucratic infighting to be waged to succeed. Trent.
Mike said something earlier that I want to circle back to as part of closing. The third point of his was to take a hard look at where we are today and self-assess. And I think context could be important for that. And one of the things that I was really struck by is when the Navy was trying to develop effective procedures for how best to address kamikaze attacks in 1945. They conducted a series of exercises. One of the things that they learned was that a well-trained crew could go from directors fore and aft to getting the anti-aircraft directors onto a target and ready to open fire with a fire control solution in 6 seconds, which is quite fast. And I think it's quite fast even for today's timeline. So for any listeners who are in exercises, I throw that out there as something, as a benchmark to compare yourselves to. But all of what we've talked about, Bryan, when you were just summarizing a few minutes ago, to me, this is a strategy question, and a core aspect of strategy is what are we going to invest in and what are we going to divest from? And right now, the Navy is very invested, in deploying forward. There's lots of demand signal there, and is not investing in this kind of work that we've talked about here. Dmitry made a very good point about having forces dedicated to doing this kind of work. And I think this is a strategic problem, and I believe it deserves a strategic answer. We need to invest. The Navy needs to invest in this. I believe as a citizen, the Navy needs to invest in this. And I would encourage more thought in this area to work out exactly how to do that.
Thanks, Trent. Yeah, excellent point that this really comes down to, at the end of the day, making strategic decisions and allocating resources to try to accomplish the operational side of innovation. I think we spent a lot of time in the Navy talking about technological innovation and not nearly enough sort of resources being applied to the operational side of the equation. Well, so thank you very much to our panelists. I really appreciate your being here. This was a fantastic discussion. And also, I appreciate you highlighting the report, Learning to Win, that Hudson Institute recently released with a couple of these authors. So with us today, thank you very much, Trent Hone, Vice President of ICF, who is one of the authors on the paper, Dmitry Filipoff from CIMSEC, the online content editor for CIMSEC, who is also one of my co-authors, and then Mike Hunzeker from George Mason University. Thank you very much for being here. And we appreciate you all visiting us today at Hudson Institute, and have a great day.